Hello, my name is Sandy Price. I am an anti-money laundering AML Manager at ICAEW. We are an AML supervisory body. This was recorded in August 2025 and reflects the regulations and requirements as at that date. And this AMLbites covers the basics of customer due diligence. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the basics of customer due diligence. Let's talk about why you should perform customer due diligence, CDD, when you might perform customer due diligence, for example, at the start of a business relationship with a client. What are the 3 stages of customer due diligence? We'll talk about identifying your client, risk assessing your client, customer verification, and we'll talk about what you should document. So if your AML supervisor comes to visit, what might they expect to see? Why should I perform customer due diligence? Well, any ICAEW firm who meets the definition of being in public practice will be in scope of the money laundering regulations, and hence they have a requirement to comply with the regulations. Regulation 27 specifically addresses the requirements of customer due diligence. Firms are also required to be able to evidence to their AML supervisor that they have applied the AML requirements appropriately, including that of customer due diligence. The objective of customer due diligence is to create a barrier to prevent criminals accessing our firm's services and abusing those services to facilitate criminal activity and the laundering of illicit gains. Performing customer due diligence or effective customer due diligence will limit the vulnerability of a firm to taking on criminal clients. So let's talk a little bit about what if you don't perform customer due diligence. Well, personally, I think the biggest risk would be that you're inadvertently facilitating money laundering. Part of customer due diligence is identifying the risks and red flags around new clients. And if you can do that effectively, it reduces the vulnerability of your firm to taking on illicit actors, and also you're protecting victims and potential victims. Robust customer due diligence and reporting suspicious activity where necessary could prevent illicit activities and could also lead to rescuing victims and vulnerable individuals. Now, if you were to get a visit from ICAEW or your supervisory body and they found that you hadn't been complying with the regulations, there's possibility of investigation, there's possibility of regulatory fine by your supervisor, and consequently reputational damage to your firm. Similarly, if law enforcement find out that you've got a client that was being involved in some nefarious activity, they're going to wonder why you as a firm haven't submitted a suspicious activity report or identified that activity, and there could be some scrutiny. So when does one perform customer due diligence? Well, the regulations are specific. You should perform customer due diligence at the start of a new business relationship, so effectively when you're taking on a new client. And that might include a new company being formed. You should then continue to consider the risks during the lifetime of the relationship. And also there may be trigger events. For example, you might get a new director, you might get a new ultimate beneficial owner, and maybe you would need to reassess the risk then. Less relevant to our firms when an occasional transaction is to be undertaken. When you have a suspicion or knowledge of money laundering, terrorist financing, so suppose you've submitted a suspicious activity report, then you would want to revisit your customer due diligence. You might also want to disengage. It's not mandatory to disengage, but certainly at the minimum, you would want to revisit your customer due diligence and revisit your risk assessment. And finally, when there is any doubt about the reliability of the identity information that you've been provided by the client. So maybe there's something come to light and you think one of the verification documents might have been falsified, you would then go back to your customer due diligence and reconsider. So if accountants want to understand how to apply the money laundering regs, they would generally refer to CCAB guidance or AMLgas guidance, which has been approved by HMT. And I've taken this from the CCAB guidance on customer due diligence, and it talks about the 3 stages of customer due diligence. We have the initial stages of identifying the client, then assessing the risk of the client being involved in criminal offences or money laundering, followed by the verification of the client, which is where we gather evidence that verifies that what we think we know is true. Are they who they say they are? And are they doing what they tell us they're doing? And if there are any risks that we've identified, can we mitigate them? First stage of customer due diligence, which would be identification. It's the bit where you get to understand and know your client. Who are they? What do they do? So who is the client? What's their name? Date of birth, residential address. You're getting information. You're not verifying it, you're just gathering it. You're asking them questions. In the case of corporates and other organisations, this would extend to understanding who ultimately owns or controls the client. These people are the ultimate beneficial owners and have to be natural persons. You want to understand what the client does, where are they based, the sources of funds or wealth, and also what do they want from you. And this is all information that you would be gathering when you were onboarding any client, I think. But it's also part of the first stage of customer due diligence. Important to note that a beneficial owner of an entity can only be a natural person, i.e. a human being, as distinct from a legal person or a company. So, for example, a trust can't be the ultimate beneficial owner. You have to look at who controls the trust. But the CCAB guidance, as I referenced in the prior slide, explains to you what the beneficial owner would be for different types of entity. For example, here we've got a corporate entity, and the beneficial owner is any individual who exercises ultimate control over the management of the body corporate or who controls the body corporate. Generally, it's anybody who has voting rights over 25%. So anybody who owns or controls directly or indirectly more than 25%. So we've talked to client identification or know your client. Then you've got stage 2 of customer due diligence, which is the risk assessment. And then you've got stage 3, which is verification. So part 2 of this series talks about risk assessment. But basically, CCAB guidance talks about having different client risk categories, maybe low, normal, and high. So you carry out your initial risk assessment, and then you might need to get evidence to verify the identity information gathered during the first stage, client verification, but also that verification may include risk mitigation. Does what they tell you stack up? Are there any red flags or risks that you need to mitigate? For example, a new client with 20 million in savings, you'd want to understand where that money came from. So the degree of verification is dependent on the risk category and it's proportionate and responsive to the risk. So for higher risk clients, more verification work should be performed. For example, understanding and evidencing sources of wealth or screening for sanctions. So the client may be who they say they are, but it doesn't mean they're not a money launderer. So you'd need to look at other risk factors. In terms of basic verification for an individual, initially you might require sight of a passport, but obviously we've talked about other areas of verification as well. For corporates and others, in addition to the entity itself, obviously we'd expect reasonable verification measures for any individual beneficial owner. So what documentation might we as your supervisor expect to see when we come out on a visit? Or even if we do it remotely, we might expect you to send in to us to review. Well, we want to know that you've identified and that you know your client. So we want to know that you've got the appropriate amount of know your client information. It can be disparate, but basically, we want to ensure that you have documentation somewhere that evidences you know who the client is. For example, if it is a company, we need to know that you know who the ultimate beneficial owners are. What's the trade of the company? Where is it based? Does it have significant assets and funds? We'd want to see a risk assessment. And this should be documented, and that will tell us your conclusion on the risk that this client may be involved in money laundering. We cover this in more detail on part 2. But basic risk assessment will consider the client itself, the risks around the services you're providing, the location of the client, whether you're handling client money perhaps, and whether you've met them. And then finally, we want to see something around verification and risk mitigation. So based on the risk, what have you done to ensure the client is who they say they are and operating the way they tell you? This might vary, as I've said, from client to client, the level of verification. Again, it's not just about verifying identity. Are there any risk factors that you need to mitigate, such as adverse media? So basically, we'd want to see an element of documentation for each of those 3 stages. Know your client, the risk assessment, and what you've done to mitigate the risk. The level of documentation can vary extensively. If you're a small firm, a sole practitioner, you might want to write a few notes down. And this would suffice if it covers the basics. And we cover, as I said, the risk assessment is in part 2. Larger firms might prefer to use checklists so they can ensure that they've evidenced they've considered all the risks. So what if I can't complete customer due diligence when I first take on the client? So normally we'd expect customer due diligence to be completed before you've established the business relationship. But there is some allowance for not completing it straight away. So if a prospective or existing client refuses to provide customer due diligence information, then you shouldn't proceed under those circumstances. But the regulations do recognise that sometimes customer due diligence may need to be completed while you're establishing the business relationship. There might be very legitimate reasons for that. Delays of this kind are permissible, but only when there is a little risk of money laundering or terrorist financing. So what resources have we got? Well, there's plenty of resources on the website, but to reference a few, we have Customer Due Diligence Hub on the website, which you'll have links to articles, help sheets, and guidance. We have a regular bulletin for our MLROs called AML Essentials, and that covers changes in regulations, updates on guidance and help sheets again. We've got regulatory and conduct news. We've got a web page for any regulatory and conduct changes and news and updates. And then we'd really like it if you'd follow us on our LinkedIn page. And that, again, if there are any updates or changes to money laundering regs or any guidance, we try and get it on there as quickly as we can. Thank you for listening. Bye.